The dream was always the same. Jack stood on a beach of black glass under a bruised purple sky. The tide was out, leaving behind a billion glistening razor-sharp shards. In the distance, a single blood-red sun was dying, sputtering like a wet match. A sound came from behind him, a dry skittering sound. He never turned. He knew what was there. He knew if he saw it, his heart would stop. So he would stare at the dying sun and wait for the chattering, insect-like noise to get closer. And just as he felt a hot, foul breath on the back of his neck, he would wake up, tangled in his sheets, his own screams stuck in his throat like a fishbone. But tonight the dream changed. He was on the beach. The glass crunched under his bare feet. The purple sky churned. But the skittering sound was gone. In its place was a profound, terrifying silence. The silence felt worse. It felt like a held breath. A predator waiting. Jack felt a strange compulsion to turn around. He had to see what was not there. He turned. The beach was empty for miles. The silence deepened, pressing in on him, and in that crushing quiet, the red sun winked out. Not faded. It just went out, like a light bulb. The darkness that fell was absolute. A physical thing that smothered him. It was a darkness that had teeth. Jack woke up, not with a scream, but with a gasp. His bedside clock read 3:14 a.m. The air in his bedroom was cold still, but something was wrong. A high-pitched keening whine was coming from outside, a sound that scraped at the inside of his skull. It grew louder, a rising shriek of tortured metal, and then it ended with a colossal earth-shaking boom that rattled the windows in their frames. It came from the woods behind his house. He threw on jeans and a sweatshirt, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He grabbed the heavy mag light from the kitchen drawer, the one he kept for power outages. Harmony Creek didn't get this kind of excitement. The loudest thing that usually happened here was Old Man Hemlock's truck backfiring. This was different. This felt wrong. The woods were a familiar place. He'd walked these paths 1,000 times. But tonight they were alien. The moonlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping fingers. A strange smell hung in the air, a mix of ozone and burnt cinnamon. Up ahead, a clearing was bathed in an eerie, pulsating blue light. He pushed through a final thicket of ferns and stopped dead. It wasn't a plane. It was long and smooth and wrong, a teardrop of something that wasn't metal or stone, half buried in a furrow of scorched earth. The blue light pulsed from a jagged crack in its side. The high-pitched whine was gone, replaced by a low, sick thrumming. A ramp of the same strange material extended from the crack, touching the forest floor, and at the bottom of the ramp lay a figure. It was long and impossibly thin, its limbs bent at angles that made Jack's stomach clench. Its skin was the color of old parchment. As he got closer, a large, almond-shaped eye swiveled to look at him. There was no panic in it, only a deep, ancient exhaustion. Jack froze, the maglite beam trembling in his hand. He was looking at an alien, a real, honest-to-God, dying alien in the woods behind his house. The creature's chest hitched. A thin, reedy voice didn't speak, but bloomed inside his head, a thought that was not his own. Help! He took a hesitant step forward. What could he do? Call 911. Hello, operator? T here is a crashed spaceship in my backyard. They'd send the men with the butterfly nets. The alien feebly lifted a hand with 3 long, delicate fingers. It gestured for him to come closer. Jack found himself moving, compelled, not by the request, but by the immense sadness radiating from the creature. He knelt beside it. The smell of ozone was stronger here, sharp and clean. The alien's fingers touched his forehead. It wasn't a physical touch. It was a jolt of ice and fire, a torrent of information pouring directly into his brain. He saw stars being born and galaxies dying. He saw civilizations rise and fall on worlds he could not name. He felt the crushing loneliness of an immense journey. And then he saw them, the others. They weren't physical beings, they were like shimmering heat haze, ripples in the air. He saw them hovering over sleeping forms, not just human, but creatures on a dozen different worlds. He saw them reach into the dreams of the sleepers with invisible tendrils. They were not malicious, they were like cosmic librarians, tidying up. They saw dreams, especially nightmares, as chaotic, messy data. They were silencing them, smoothing them out, bringing a peaceful, dreamless sleep to the universe. Then came the warning, the core of the message, a truth so terrible it felt like a physical blow. A single, clear thought that seared itself into his memory. They don't understand. The dreams are not noise. They are a shield, a psychic wall. Nightmares are the prophecies that keep the doom at bay. By dreaming of the darkness, you hold it back. By silencing the dreams, they are opening the door. Don't let them silence the dreams. They are killing you all and they don't even know it. The pressure in his head vanished. The alien's hand fell to the ground. The large dark eye dimmed, the life within it extinguishing like the sun in his dream. The blue light from the ship flickered one last time and died. Jack was alone in the dark woods, kneeling in the dirt, the silence deeper and more absolute than ever before. He was a history teacher from a small town, and he had just been given the job of saving the world. The sun rose on a world that felt fundamentally different. Jack stumbled out of the woods as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees. He hadn't slept. His mind was a frantic swirl of impossible images, and a warning that echoed with the finality of a tombstone. He looked back. There was no blue light, no thrumming ship, just trees. It was as if it had never happened. He went straight to the phone and called Sheriff Brody. His hand shook so badly he had to dial twice. "Jack, it's 6 a.m. Brody's voice was gravelly with sleep. "Dave, something happened last night. In the woods behind my house. A crash." Jack's voice was a hoarse whisper. "A crash. Like a car. Number, not a car. Something bigger. You need to come out here." There was a long pause. "Jack, were you on the whiskey last night?" "Number, I am telling you, Dave, I saw it. It wasn't from around here." Another pause. This one longer, filled with the unspoken history of their friendship. Brody had seen Jack through his divorce, the lonely nights that followed. He knew Jack wasn't a liar, but he also knew Jack was a man under a lot of quiet pressure. "All right, Jack. I'll be out in an hour. Don't go touching anything." An hour later, Brody's cruiser crunched up the gravel driveway. Dave Brody was a big man, his uniform straining at the buttons over his belly. He had a kind, weary face that had seen every minor drama Harmony Creek had to offer. A spaceship crash was not on the list. Jack led him into the woods to the clearing. He pointed at the furrow in the earth. It was right here, half buried. Brody walked the area, kicking at the dirt with the toe of his boot. Here is some disturbed earth, Jack. Could be anything. A buck chasing a doe. Kids on dirt bikes. There was a smell, Dave. Ozone and a body. Jack's voice cracked on the last word. Brody stopped and looked at him, his expression softening with concern. A body? Jack, if there was a body, we'd have a whole different situation here. T here is nothing. No blood, no debris, no scorch marks even. Just a big rut in the ground. He was right. The clearing was pristine. The deep furrow was there, undeniable, but everything else was gone. The ship, the dying alien, all of it vanished. It was as if the forest had healed itself overnight. I know what I saw, Jack said, his voice small. Maybe you had a bad dream, Jack. A real vivid one. You said you have those sometimes. This was real. But even as he said it, a seed of doubt began to sprout. Was it possible? A dream so powerful it felt like reality? The memory of the alien's touch, the flood of information felt more real than the coffee he'd choked down that morning. But the evidence, or lack thereof, was damning. Brody put a heavy hand on his shoulder. Go home. Get some sleep. If anything turns up, you'll be the first to know. Jack walked back to his house feeling like a fool. He watched Brody's cruiser disappear down the road. The world looked normal. The sun was shining. Birds were singing. But the alien's warning was a cold stone in his gut. They are opening the door. He went to the diner for breakfast, needing the noise and the normalcy. Brenda, the waitress, slid a cup of coffee in front of him. You look like you've seen a ghost, Jack, she said, popping her gum. Just a rough night, he mumbled. Tell me about it, she said, but her smile was wide and genuine. I slept like a log. First time in years. Usually I have these awful dreams, you know. My teeth falling out, being late for a test. But last night? Nothing. Just, well, quiet. It was wonderful. Jack looked up at her, a chill crawling up his spine. No dreams. Not a one. Woke up feeling like $1,000,000. Old man Hemlock was at the counter, stirring his oatmeal. I heard that, same here. Best sleep I've had since the Eisenhower administration. Usually my wife's snoring gives me nightmares about a bear caught in a wood chipper. Last night I didn't hear a thing. Slept straight through. A murmur of agreement went through the handful of early morning patrons. Everyone had slept well. Deeply, peacefully, dreamlessly. Jack's coffee cup rattled in its saucer. He looked out the window at the peaceful main street of Harmony Creek. People were walking, smiling, greeting each other. There was a lightness in the air, a distinct lack of the usual morning grumpiness. It looked like a town that had collectively woken up on the right side of the bed. He thought of the shimmering heat haze figures from the vision. The cosmic librarians, tidying up the messy chaos of the human subconscious. They were here. They had started their work in Harmony Creek. He paid for his coffee and left, his breakfast untouched. Everyone was happy. Everyone was rested. A town without nightmares. It should have been a good thing, a blessing. But Jack, with the alien's dying words burned into his soul, knew it was the beginning of the end. It was the calm before the storm, the silence before the door creaked open. The next few days were the strangest of Jack's life. Harmony Creek was transformed. Productivity at the local lumber mill went up by 15%. The high school attendance office reported the fewest late arrivals in its history. Fights in the schoolyard ceased. People were nicer to each other. They smiled more, they seemed. Balanced, the town was living up to its name. And it was the most unsettling thing Jack had ever witnessed. The topic of sleep came up everywhere. At the grocery store, in the faculty lounge, over backyard fences. It was a common refrain. "I've been sleeping so well. I feel so rested. I can't remember the last time I had a nightmare." No one questioned it. They accepted it as a gift, a bizarre but welcome town-wide wave of good fortune. Jack, however, felt like he was living in a horror movie. He was the only one who knew the truth, the only one who saw the placid smiles as masks. He tried to sleep, but when he did, he forced himself to remember the dream of the black glass beach. He clung to his nightmare like a life raft in a placid, deadly sea. He was terrified of the dreamless peace everyone else was enjoying. He knew it was the sound of the locks being unfastened. He threw himself into research. He spent hours in the school library and late nights on his home computer, diving into obscure folklore, psychology, and quantum physics. He read about collective consciousness, the idea that all human minds were linked on some subtle level. He read ancient texts that described dreams as whispers from the gods, as warnings of famine and war. He read about theoretical physics, about how observation could affect reality, how the universe might be a matrix of probabilities that collapsed into a single outcome only when perceived. A wild, terrifying theory began to form in his mind. The dying alien's message wasn't a metaphor, it was literal. Nightmares are the prophecies that keep the doom at bay. What if humanity's collective nightmares, our shared fears of falling, of drowning, of being hunted, were a kind of psychic immune system? What if, by dreaming about a bridge collapsing, enough minds focused on that possibility that it subconsciously reinforced the bridge's structural integrity in the real world? What if our fear of the dark and what lurked within it was a constant, low-level psychic patrol that kept actual, literal darkness from seeping into the cracks of the world? It sounded insane. It was the kind of thinking that got you a padded room and a colorful assortment of pills. But it was the only thing that made sense of the warning. The whisperers, as he'd started calling the shimmering aliens in his head, weren't just erasing bad dreams. They were dismantling the planet's defense system, one sleeping mind at a time. He tried to talk to Brody again. He found him directing traffic around a minor fender bender on Main Street. "Dave, we need to talk. It's about what people are saying. About the sleep." Brody sighed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Jack, everyone's in a good mood. Let's not borrow trouble. It's probably something in the water." He said it as a joke, but his eyes were clear and calm. Too calm. "It's not in the water," Jack insisted, his voice rising. "They're being silenced. Their dreams are being stolen. It's dangerous." A few people turned to look. Jack saw the pity in their eyes. Poor Jack Callahan. Hasn't been right since the divorce. "Go home, Jack," Brody said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Get some rest." Jack walked away, his cheeks burning with frustration and embarrassment. He was the town Cassandra, doomed to spout warnings that no one would believe. That afternoon it happened, the first crack. He was in his classroom trying to grade papers on the Peloponnesian War. The students were gone for the day. The school was quiet. Suddenly, a shadow fell over his desk. He looked up at the window. The sky, which had been a brilliant blue, was filled with birds. Thousands of them. Starlings, sparrows, pigeons, crows. They were flying in a tight, frantic vortex directly over the town square. He ran to the window, his heart seizing. The birds weren't just flying. They were falling. One after another, they simply stopped flapping and dropped from the sky like stones. They rained down on the gazebo, on the lawn, on the roof of the diner. It was a silent, feathered apocalypse. Within minutes, it was over. The sky was empty again. Jack stared out the window at the town square, now littered with the small, still bodies of hundreds of birds. It was unnatural. It was wrong. There was no sound, no reason. Just a sudden, inexplicable death. He thought of the common, low-grade anxiety people have about nature turning against them. The fear you see in movies of birds attacking, of the natural order coming undone, a fear that was probably dreamed about by thousands of people every night. Until now. Now there was no one dreaming that fear. The psychic wall that kept that specific bizarre possibility in check was gone, and something had just slipped through the crack. It was a small thing in the grand scheme, just a bunch of dead birds. But Jack knew, with a certainty that chilled into the bone, that it was only the beginning. The door was ajar, and much bigger things were waiting on the other side. The dead birds was officially explained away as a freak atmospheric event, a pocket of toxic gas released from a geological fissure, or mass poisoning from a pesticide spill upriver. The explanations were plausible, printed in the local paper, and discussed with concerned frowns at the diner. But within a day, the incident was largely forgotten. The placid calm of Harmony Creek was a powerful anesthetic, dulling the edge of even the most bizarre tragedies. People were too well rested to worry for long. Jack wasn't sleeping. He was drinking coffee until his hands shook, terrified of the dreamless void. He needed his nightmare. He needed the beach of black glass to feel sane. He felt a desperate, lonely kinship with the skittering, unseen thing from his old dream. At least it was something. The silence was the real monster. He started seeing them, the whisperers. It wasn't with his eyes, not directly. It was more like a glitch in his perception. He'd be looking at a student nodding off in his history class. And for a split second, the air above the student's head would seem to shimmer and distort, like heat rising from asphalt. He saw it over his neighbor snoring in a hammock. He saw it in the reflection of a window, a brief, oily ripple in the space, over a sleeping baby in a stroller. They were everywhere, invisible, silent, relentlessly efficient. He felt like he was the only person in the world who could see the ghosts that were haunting everyone else. The touch from the dying alien had done something to him, tuned him to their frequency. It was a terrible gift. He tried to disrupt them. One night he saw the telltale shimmer in the air, over the roof of his ex-wife's house. He knew she was in there, sleeping peacefully, her mind being scrubbed clean. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his exhaustion. He got in his car, drove to her street and laid on the horn. Lights flicked on up and down the block. A window slid open in her house. "Jack, what in God's name are you doing?" "Just wanted to make sure you were okay," he yelled back, his voice sounding thin and crazy even to his own ears. "It's 2 a.m. You are going to wake the whole neighborhood." "Good," he shouted. "Wake up, everybody wake up." He saw her silhouette in the window, her hands on her hips. The look of anger and deep, deep disappointment was clear even from a distance. He drove away before Brody could show up. The next day she called him. Her voice was strained, a carefully constructed wall of patience. "Jack, people are talking. Brody called me. He's worried. I am worried. Are you okay?" "I am fine, Sharon. I am trying to warn you." "Warn me about what? About getting a good night's sleep?" "Jack, this has to stop. You need help. A therapist, maybe." "You don't understand." "No, I don't," she said. and her voice finally broke. "I don't understand why you are doing this. I don't understand why you have to self-destruct. Please, Jack, for me, get help." She hung up. The dial tone buzzed in his ear, the loneliest sound in the world. He was completely isolated. The town's concern was a smothering blanket, their kindness a cage. They were all trying to help him, to guide him back to the serene, dreamless peace they were all enjoying. They were trying to lead him to the slaughter. He started keeping a journal, documenting everything. The shimmer he saw over Mrs. Gable's prize-winning petunias, followed by the entire flower bed turning to black slimy rot the next day. The momentary distortion he witnessed in the air at the town's water tower, a day before a major pipe burst, flooding the basements on Elm Street. He was charting the path of destruction. Each strange, localized disaster was preceded by the presence of a whisperer. They weren't causing the events directly. They were simply creating a void, erasing the collective, subconscious fear of that specific thing happening. They were erasing the nightmare of blight, and so the blight came. They were erasing the nightmare of a flood, and so the water rose. He felt a growing sense of panic. The disasters were getting bigger. Dead birds were one thing, a burst water main was another. What would happen when they erased the really big nightmares? The primal ones, the fear of fire, the fear of the earth shaking, the fear of things with too many teeth and too many legs that live in the dark. One evening he was sitting in his darkened living room, staring out the window. The streetlights cast a pale yellow glow. He saw his neighbor, Mr. Henderson, walk out to get his mail, and then he saw it. A shimmer. Not over Henderson's head, but over his whole house. It was bigger and more intense than any he'd seen before. A violent, silent churning in the air. Jack stood up, his blood turning to ice. He didn't know what specific nightmare was being erased. He only knew it was a big one. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit and watch. He ran out of his house across the lawn, his mind screaming a single frantic thought. Wake him up. You have to wake him up. Jack pounded on the Hendersons' front door. Mr. Henderson, wake up. You have to get out of the house. Lights came on inside. The door opened a crack, held by a brass security chain. Mr. Henderson's face, puffy with sleep, appeared in the gap. He was a retired accountant, a man whose life was governed by order and predictability. Callahan, what is it? Is something on fire? Yes. No. I don't know, Jack stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the air above the house, at the shimmering distortion only he could see. You just have to get out. Now. Please. Henderson's confusion curdled into annoyance. Have you been drinking, Callahan? You are making a scene. Listen to me, Jack pleaded, his voice raw. Something bad is about to happen to this house. The only bad thing happening right now is you waking up my wife, Henderson grumbled, and started to close the door. At that exact moment, a low groan echoed from the ground beneath their feet. It wasn't a sound so much as a feeling, a deep, sickening vibration that seemed to loosen the fillings in Jack's teeth. A spiderweb of cracks shot across the Hendersons' pristine concrete porch. Henderson's eyes went wide. The groan intensified, becoming a grinding roar. The house shuddered violently as if seized by a giant invisible hand. A picture fell from the wall inside. Mrs. Henderson screamed. Go! Jack yelled, grabbing the edge of the door and pulling. The security chain snapped. He dragged a stunned Mr. Henderson out onto the lawn, just as the ground gave way. It didn't happen like an earthquake. It was quieter, more sinister. The earth under the Henderson house simply dissolved. The manicured lawn, the prize-winning rose bushes, the two-story colonial home, all of it slid downwards into a newly formed, perfectly circular, impossibly deep hole. It was less a sinkhole and more like a wound opening in the earth. The house went down with a final percussive humph of displaced air. And then there was nothing but a dark, gaping maw where a home had stood moments before. Dust and the smell of damp earth filled the air. Neighbors were spilling out of their houses, drawn by the noise and the shaking. They stared, mouths agape, at the giant hole in the middle of their quiet suburban street. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson stood on their lawn, wrapped in each other's arms, shaking uncontrollably. Brody's cruiser, siren blaring, screeched to a halt at the end of the street. Brody got out, his face pale in the flashing red and blue lights. He looked from the hole to the Hendersons and then to Jack. His professional calm was gone. This wasn't dead birds or a leaky pipe. This was a house. A whole house just gone. "Jack," Brody said, his voice barely a whisper, "what did you know?" "I tried to warn him," Jack said, his whole body trembling with adrenaline and terror. "I saw it coming." This time, no one looked at him with pity. They looked at him with fear. The next day, geologists from the State University arrived. They had no answers. The sinkhole was, in their words, geologically unprecedented. There were no underground caverns, no evidence of erosion. It was as if a giant core sample had been surgically removed from the planet. The incident shattered the town's placid veneer. Fear, for the first time in weeks, began to creep back into Harmony Creek. People looked at their own homes with suspicion. They walked on the pavement as if it might turn to liquid at any moment. The dreamless sleep was no longer a comfort. It was a vulnerability. Jack became a reluctant prophet. People started approaching him, their voices hushed. "What else do you see, Jack? Is my house safe?" He had no answers for them. He could only see the shimmer, the presence of the whisperers. He couldn't predict the specific form the disaster would take. He felt the shift. The nightmares were trying to come back. The collective subconscious was fighting back, trying to spin up its webs of fear to patch the holes in reality. But the whisperers were relentless. It was a silent, invisible war being fought in the sleeping minds of the town. And the casualties were happening in the waking world. The disasters became more frequent and more surreal. A localized hyper-intense electrical storm formed over the library, frying every computer, phone, and digital device inside, but leaving the neighboring buildings untouched. A thick, foul-smelling fog rolled in off the creek one afternoon, causing anyone who breathed it to suffer from vivid, terrifying hallucinations. For an hour before it dissipated as quickly as it came. Jack understood the pattern. Fear of the ground collapsing, fear of technology rebelling, fear of losing one's mind. Each event was a classic nightmare, made real. The whisperers were methodically working their way through the catalogue of human terror, dismantling the psychic defenses one by one. He knew what the big ones were. The ultimate fears, buried deep in the collective psyche. Fear of uncontrollable fire, fear of plagues. And the deepest, most primal fear of all, the fear of the monster in the dark. He knew the whisperers would get to that one eventually. They were systematic. And when they finally silenced humanity's oldest nightmare, Jack had no doubt that the monster would be real, and it would be hungry. Jack's house became an unlikely headquarters for the bewildered and the terrified. People he'd known his whole life, People who had dismissed him as a crackpot just a week ago now sat in his living room, their faces etched with a fear that was slowly overpowering the unnatural calm. They brought him stories. Strange occurrences, glimpses of things that shouldn't be. Old man Hemlock swore he saw a face in the static of his television screen, a face with too many eyes. Brenda from the diner said the reflection she saw in the polished coffee machine wasn't her own for a split second. These were small things, momentary lapses in reality, but they were increasing. The fabric of the world was fraying at the edges. Jack listened to them all, his journal open on his lap. He wasn't just a prophet anymore, he was a priest, taking confession from a town losing its mind. He explained his theory. He told them about the alien, the warning, the whisperers, and the dream shield. They listened, not because it made sense, but because the official explanations made even less sense. When your house has been swallowed by the earth, you become more open to unconventional ideas. So what you are saying, Brody said, sitting heavily on Jack's sofa, his sheriff's uniform looking out of place among the dusty books, is that our nightmares protect us? That all the bad things I've ever dreamed about, being chased, falling, failing an exam I never studied for, were actually helping? That's the theory, Jack said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. They're not just random brain firings. They are a manifestation of the collective consciousness focusing on a negative potential, and in doing so, preventing it from becoming reality. It's like a psychic vaccination. The whisperers are cosmic anti-vaxxers. They think they're curing a disease, but they're actually disabling our immune system. Brody rubbed his face, the picture of a man pushed far beyond his pay grade. And these whisperers, you are the only one who can see them. The alien's touch, it changed me. It's like I can see on a different frequency now. But I think others are starting to sense them. The glitches, the strange feelings. That's the effect of their presence. A thought struck Jack. A sudden blinding flash of insight. Wait a minute, the glitches. The face in the static, the wrong reflection, those aren't side effects of the disasters. Those are the things trying to get through. The things our nightmares use to keep locked up. They're testing the walls, finding the weak spots. The room went silent. The fear in the air was thick enough to taste. The problem was no longer just sinkholes and freak storms. The problem was what came next. We need to fight back, Brenda said, her voice trembling but determined. But how? We can't punch a shimmer in the air. We can't fight them, Jack said, his mind racing. We have to fight their effect. They're stopping the nightmares, so we have to start them again. We need to remind people how to be scared. We need to force them to dream. How do you force someone to have a nightmare? Hemlock asked, scratching his bald head. I don't know, Jack admitted. A scary story? A horror movie? It needs to be more powerful than that. It needs to be a psychic jolt. Something that bypasses the conscious mind and hits the subconscious directly. He looked around the room at the scared faces. These were good people. They were loggers, waitresses, teachers, and sheriffs. They weren't soldiers in a psychic war. He felt a wave of despair wash over him. The task was impossible. Just then there was a soft knock on the door. Everyone jumped. Jack opened it to find a young woman standing on his porch. She was maybe 17, with dark, intense eyes and a mane of unruly black hair. She wore a faded band t-shirt and ripped jeans. He recognized her from his junior history class. Sarah, a quiet, artistic girl who sat in the back and drew strange, elaborate symbols in her notebook. She always looked tired. Mr. Callahan, she said, her voice soft. Can I talk to you? Jack ushered her inside. The others looked at the teenager with curiosity. What is it, Sarah? Sarah hugged her arms to her chest. She looked exhausted, her eyes shadowed with dark circles that Jack recognized all too well. It's the dreams, she whispered. Everyone's saying they've stopped, but I haven't. They're worse than ever. A hush fell over the room. What do you dream about? Jack asked, his voice gentle. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I dreamed about the birds the night before they fell. I dreamed about a big hole opening up and swallowing a house last night. She swallowed hard, her gaze flicking nervously around the room. Last night, I dreamed that the high school burned down, not with normal fire. The flames were black and they screamed. Jack stared at her. While the whisperers were silencing the town, they had somehow missed her. Or maybe her mind was different, more resistant. She wasn't just having nightmares. She was having the town's nightmares. All the suppressed fear and anxiety was being funneled into her sleeping mind. She was the last bastion, the final outpost of the dream shield. Sarah, Jack said, his voice filled with a new, desperate hope. I think you are the key. I think you might be able to save us. He saw the fear in her young eyes, the terror of a burden she never asked for. But behind the fear, he saw something else. A flicker of strength, a resilience that the rest of Harmony Creek had lost. What do I have to do? She asked. Jack looked from the terrified girl to the scared townspeople in his living room. He had a weapon. He had a plan taking shape in his mind, a wild, improbable plan that involved an old radio tower, a teenage girl's nightmares, and a desperate gamble to scream a psychic alarm so loud it would wake the entire world. The plan was insane. Jack knew it. And he could see the doubt warring with desperation on the faces of his small band of followers. The old radio station, Wish Koo, sat on a hill overlooking Harmony Creek. It had been decommissioned for years, a relic of an analog age, but the broadcast tower was still there, a skeleton of rusted iron pointing at the sky. Jack's idea was to use it not to broadcast sound, but to broadcast a feeling, to broadcast a nightmare. The tower is an amplifier, he explained, pacing his living room like a caged animal. We hook up a signal generator, something that creates a carrier wave. But instead of modulating it with a voice or music, we modulate it with a psychic signal, with a dream. He looked at Sarah. With your dream. Sarah, who had been quiet until now, looked up. You want to put my nightmare on the radio? Essentially, yes, Jack said. If you can focus on one of your dreams, a really powerful one, a primal one, maybe we can use your unique sensitivity to imprint that fear onto the carrier wave. The tower would then broadcast it over the whole town. It would be like a psychic dog whistle. It might be enough to jolt people's minds out of this dreamless state, to force their own subconscious defenses to kick back in. Brody, ever the pragmatist, shook his head. Jack, I don't even have words for what this is. We're talking about breaking into private property, to use defunct equipment to broadcast a psychic scream based on a teenager's bad dream. Every part of that sentence is illegal and crazy. Do you have a better idea, Dave? Jack shot back. Last night, a section of the highway on the edge of town buckled and twisted like licorice. The state engineers are calling it spontaneous asphalt fatigue. We both know what it was. It was the collective fear of a car crash, of the road itself betraying you, being erased. What's next? The dam? The old nuclear plant 2 counties over. We are running out of time. The mention of the nuclear plant sucked the air out of the room. That was a fear everyone shared, a low-level dread that had been a part of their lives for decades. What would happen if the nightmare of a meltdown was silenced? Brody's shoulders slumped in defeat. Okay, Jack. Okay. Jack. Okay. What do you need? The plan came together in a flurry of hushed, frantic activity. Hemlock, who had been a radio repairman in his youth, claimed he could get the old transmitter working. Just need juice and a few new vacuum tubes. I've got some in my workshop. Brenda's job was supplies, coffee, food, flashlights, the logistics of a revolution. Brody's role was the most difficult. He had to keep the authorities and the increasingly panicked townspeople away from the hill. He had to create a cordon, use his authority to buy them time. I'll say we have a gas leak, he said, a grim set to his jaw. A big one. Mandatory evacuation of the area. It'll only work for a few hours. That left Jack and Sarah. Their job was the heart of the operation. Jack could handle the technical setup with Hemlock, but Sarah's task was the most crucial and the most dangerous. She had to be the source. She had to delve into the darkest corners of her own mind, find the most terrifying nightmare she had, and hold on to it, focus on it with all her might, so it could be broadcast to the world. Which one? She asked Jack later as they sat in his kitchen, the quiet before the storm. Which dream should I use? It has to be universal, Jack said. Something that resonates with everyone. Not something specific, like failing a test. Something deeper, older. Sarah stared into her cup of tea. Tea here is one, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I've only had it once, a few nights ago. It was the worst one. Tell me. I was in my room in the dark. I knew something was there with me. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it breathing. It was a wet, ragged sound, and I could smell it. It smelled like damp soil and rotten meat. I was under my covers, pretending to be asleep, thinking that if I didn't move, it wouldn't see me. But I knew it could see me. It was just enjoying the fear. It was standing right next to my bed, and it was slowly reaching a hand down toward me. A cold shiver went down Jack's spine. It was the boogeyman, the monster under the bed, the primal childhood fear of the thing in the dark. It was perfect. It was a fear that every human being had felt at some point in their life. That's the one, Jack said. Can you go back there, in your mind? Sarah nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. I don't think I ever really left. Jack felt a surge of guilt. He was asking a child to become a living sacrifice, to immerse herself in terror for the sake of everyone else. He was no better than the ancient priests who sent a maiden to appease the dragon. Sarah, you don't have to do this, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She looked up at him, and the fear in her eyes was now mixed with a startling resolve. What happens if we don't? She asked. What happens when the whisperers erase this dream for good? Will the thing in the dark stop being a dream and start being real? Jack had no answer. They both knew the truth. Let's go, Sarah said, standing up. Let's give them a nightmare they'll never forget. The drive up the winding dirt road to the old W-Section station was tense. Brody's cruiser led the way, followed by Hemlock's pickup truck, loaded with tools and equipment, and finally Jack's car, with Sarah silent in the passenger seat. The air was heavy and still, charged with an unnatural energy. Jack glanced at Sarah. She was pale, her hands clenched in her lap. She was staring out the window, but he knew she wasn't seeing the trees. She was preparing to walk back into the darkest room of her mind. At the base of the hill, Brody set up his roadblock, positioning his cruiser across the road and turning on the flashing lights. "This is it," he said over the radio. "You've got maybe 2 hours before the county sends another unit to see why I've gone dark. Make it count." The station was a sad, concrete box covered in graffiti. The big antenna tower loomed over them, a rusted lattice of iron against the twilight sky. Hemlock jimmied the lock on the door with a crowbar, and they stepped inside. The place smelled of dust, mildew, and dead mice. Old soundproofing foam was crumbling off the walls. In the center of the main room was the transmitter, a hulking metal cabinet with a bank of glass-fronted dials and switches. "She's a beaut, ain't she?" Hemlock said with a grin, running a reverent hand over the dusty metal. "They don't make 'em like this anymore." He and Jack got to work immediately. They powered up the portable generator Hemlock had brought, and the station flickered to life with a low hum. A few bare bulbs cast a sickly yellow light over the room. Hemlock started replacing brittle wires and old vacuum tubes. His movements deft and practiced, a man reunited with an old love. Jack's job was the modification. He had a small experimental device he'd salvaged from the high school physics lab, an encephalograph, designed to read brainwaves. His plan was to wire the output from the EEG directly into the transmitter's modulator input. In theory, instead of a microphone's electrical signal, the transmitter would be fed by the electrical patterns of Sarah's brain. It was a mad scientist's setup, cobbled together with hope and desperation. "This is crazy," Jack muttered, stripping a wire with his teeth. "All the best ideas are," Hemlock said without looking up. While they worked, Sarah found a corner and sat on an old wooden stool. She closed her eyes. Jack watched her, his heart aching. He saw her brow furrow, her breathing become shallow. She was going in. She was walking into the dark room, pulling the covers up to her chin, listening to the wet, ragged breathing of the monster. An hour passed. The transmitter was ready. A single green light glowed on its front panel. "We're hot," Hemlock announced, wiping grease from his hands. "Ready to broadcast whatever you want to feed it." Jack brought the modified EEG headset over to Sarah. "It's time," he said softly. She opened her eyes. They were wide with a terror so profound it was almost sublime. "It's here, Mr. Callahan," she whispered. "It's right beside me. I can feel its hand. It's so cold." "Hold on, Sarah. Just hold on to that feeling," Jack said, his own voice shaking. He gently placed the headset with its web of sensors on her head. He connected the final wire to the transmitter. He stood before the main console. All he had to do was flip a single large red switch, the broadcast switch. And then the world outside the station began to change. The low hum of the equipment was joined by another sound, a low guttural whispering that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, seeming to writhe and coalesce. The air grew cold, a damp, cellar-like chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What's happening?" Hemlock asked, his eyes wide. "They know," Jack said, staring at the writhing shadows. "The whisperers. They know what we're about to do. They're trying to stop us." The whispering grew louder, weaving into patterns that almost sounded like words, promises of pain and madness. A bare light bulb overhead flickered and burst, showering the floor with glass. Outside, A strange, thick fog was rolling up the hill, a fog that was unnaturally dark. It swirled around the base of the broadcast tower like a malevolent tide. Jack knew what this was. The Whisperers weren't just erasing nightmares anymore. By bringing a primal fear into such sharp focus, Sarah was acting like a psychic lightning rod. She was drawing the very thing she feared out of the realm of possibility and into reality. The monster in the dark was coming. "We have to do it now," Jack yelled over the growing noise. He reached for the red switch. As his fingers touched the cool bakelite, a shadow detached itself from the corner of the room. It was vaguely man-shaped, but its limbs were too long and it moved with a twitching, unnatural gait. It flowed across the floor towards Sarah. Hemlock let out a yell and swung the crowbar, a futile gesture against a thing made of darkness. Jack didn't hesitate. He slammed the switch down. The transmitter roared to life. The dials on the front glowed with an intense pulsing light. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, from the tower outside, a wave of absolute, unadulterated terror washed over the world. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A psychic scream that struck every living mind in Harmony Creek. The moment the switch was thrown, the world went silent. The guttural whispering in the station stopped. The writhing shadows froze. The thing flowing towards Sarah dissolved into nothingness. It was as if someone had pressed a universal pause button. But it was the silence of a held breath. From the top of the rust-red tower, an invisible wave of pure, primal fear radiated outwards. It was the synthesized terror of Sarah's nightmare, amplified 1,000 times, a psychic tsunami crashing over the sleeping town below. In his car at the bottom of the hill, Sheriff Brody felt it hit. One moment he was sipping cold coffee. The next his heart was trying to claw its way out of his chest. Every childhood fear he'd ever had came rushing back. The certainty that something was under his bed, the shape in the closet, the face at the window. He gripped his steering wheel, knuckles white. A scream caught in his throat. All over Harmony Creek it was the same. People who had been enjoying months of peaceful, dreamless slumber were suddenly catapulted into the most terrifying nightmare of their lives. They were all in a dark room. They could all hear the wet, ragged breathing. They could all feel the cold touch of an unseen hand. Lights began to flick on all across town, one by one, then in clusters, then in a flood. Shouts and screams echoed through the quiet streets. People stumbled out of their houses, their faces pale with a terror they hadn't felt in months. The unnatural calm was shattered, replaced by a raw, vital, and exquisitely human panic. In the radio station, Jack, Hemlock, and Sarah felt it too, but they were at the epicenter. The feeling was so intense it brought them to their knees. Jack gasped for air, his mind filled with the image of a gaunt, smiling face peering at him from the shadows. Hemlock was curled in a ball, muttering about spiders. Only Sarah seemed to withstand the direct blast. The terror was coming from her. She was the eye of the storm. She was pale and trembling, sweat beading on her forehead, but her eyes were open and focused. She was holding the nightmare, containing it, even as it was being broadcast to the world. "It's working," she gasped, her voice strained. "I can feel them, waking up." As the town below descended into shared terror, the environment around the radio station began to stabilize. The unnatural fog receded. The air warmed. Reality, which had been stretched to the breaking point, seemed to snap back into place. They had done it. They had forced the town to dream, to be afraid, to rebuild the psychic walls. But the Whisperers weren't going to give up without a fight. The silence broke. A new sound began, not from the walls but from outside. A high-frequency shriek, a sound of pure rage and frustration that scraped at the edges of hearing. Jack looked out the door. The air itself seemed to be vibrating. The shimmering distortions he used to see only in glimpses were now everywhere, coalescing, gathering their strength for a final, direct assault. They had been trying to dismantle the defenses subtly. Now, subtlety was over. "They're coming," Jack yelled. "We need to go." He pulled the EEG headset from Sarah's head. She slumped forward, utterly drained, and would have fallen if he hadn't caught her. The terror broadcast ceased. "Get her to the truck," Jack ordered Hemlock. Hemlock, shaking off the last dregs of his own fear, helped Jack carry the semi-conscious girl out of the station. The shrieking was louder now, a physical pressure against their skulls. As they stumbled towards Hemlock's truck, the ground began to shake. Not like the sinkhole, but a violent, angry tremor. The great iron tower swayed, groaning in protest. Rivets popped from its joints like gunfire. "It's coming down," Hemlock shouted. They scrambled into the truck, Jack and Sarah in the cab, Hemlock throwing himself into the driver's seat. He turned the key, and the engine sputtered, coughed, and died. "No, no, no," Hemlock pleaded, turning the key again. The engine just clicked. The electrical field generated by the enraged Whisperers was too intense. The groaning of the tower grew louder, a death rattle of tortured metal. It began to tilt, slowly at first, then with gathering speed directly towards them. This was it. The end. They had saved the town only to be crushed by their own weapon. Jack held Sarah close, shielding her with his body, and squeezed his eyes shut. At the last second, Brody's cruiser roared up the hill, its engine somehow immune to the interference. He skidded to a stop beside the truck. "Get in! Now!" he screamed, his face a mask of adrenaline. They didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled out of the dead truck and piled into the police cruiser, Jack pulling Sarah into the back seat. Brody slammed the car into reverse and stomped on the gas. The cruiser shot backwards just as the massive radio tower came crashing down. Tons of rusted iron slammed into the exact spot where the truck had been, crushing it into a pancake of twisted metal with a sound like the end of the world. Brody spun the wheel, tires screaming, and sped down the hill, away from the shrieking, vibrating air and the wreckage of their desperate hope. In the rearview mirror, Jack saw the shimmering distortions converge on the ruined station. A swarm of angry, invisible hornets, their prize snatched away at the last possible second. They had won. But he looked at the exhausted, pale face of the teenage girl, asleep on his shoulder, and he knew the victory had come at a terrible price. They drove back into a town awakened. The streets were filled with people in pajamas and bathrobes, huddled together on lawns, talking in hushed, frightened tones. They were scared, but they were alive and real, in a way they hadn't been for months. The glazed, placid look was gone from their eyes, replaced by the familiar spark of human anxiety. It was the most beautiful thing Jack had ever seen. Brody drove them to Jack's house. Hemlock, still shaken, poured himself a stiff drink from Jack's liquor cabinet. Jack gently laid Sarah on the sofa and covered her with a blanket. Her breathing was shallow, but steady. She was deeply asleep, but for the first time he sensed it was a normal sleep, a healing sleep. The sun began to rise, casting a clean morning light over Harmony Creek. The world felt solid again. Jack stepped out onto his porch and took a deep breath. The air was just air. The ground was just ground. He looked at the Hendersons' property. The gaping hole was still there. A stark reminder of what had happened, but it no longer felt like a wound. It was a scar. Brody came out and stood beside him, holding a mug of coffee. "They're gone, aren't they?" he asked. Jack nodded. "I think so. We flooded their system. We gave them what they hate most: chaos, terror, unpredictable human emotion. They're librarians who stumbled into a mosh pit. They've probably moved on to find a quieter species to help." "And the things?" Brody asked, his voice low. "The things that we're trying to get through." "The walls are back up," Jack said. "The nightmares are back. People are dreaming of monsters again, so the monsters have to stay in the dreams." He looked at the houses across the street, where lights were on and families were huddled together. "We're safe." But a deep melancholy settled over him. Sarah had paid a price. He didn't know the extent of it yet, but he knew that no one could channel that much raw fear and emerge unchanged. She had taken the brunt of the town's psychic burden onto her young shoulders. She was a hero, and no one but the three of them would ever know it. A few days later, life in Harmony Creek had found a new normal. The sinkhole was fenced off and became a morbid tourist attraction. The story of the mass hallucination, as it came to be officially called, became a local legend. People went back to having nightmares about being late for work and their teeth falling out. They complained about being tired. It was bliss. Sarah recovered slowly. She was quieter than before, her eyes holding a depth that seemed far too old for a teenager. She still drew in her notebooks, but the symbols were different now, less frantic, more ordered. She told Jack she didn't have the big nightmares anymore, just small ones, normal ones. He was visiting her one afternoon. They were sitting on her porch swing, watching the world go by. "Do you think they'll ever come back?" she asked. "The Whisperers, I don't know," Jack admitted. "The universe is a big place. Maybe. Or maybe others like them will come along. And we'll have to be ready," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her, at this brave, changed young woman, and he finally understood the full meaning of the dying alien's warning. It wasn't just a one-time event. It was the permanent condition of humanity. They were a species living on a cliff edge, protected from a fall into an abyss of horror only by the collective power of their own anxieties. Their fears were not a weakness. They were their greatest strength. Their nightmares were not a curse, but their most sacred duty. It was a terrible, fragile, and strangely beautiful balance. That night, Jack went to bed and he dreamed. He was on the beach of black glass, under the bruised purple sky. He heard the familiar, dry, skittering sound behind him. He didn't feel the old panic. He didn't feel the need to run. He just stood there, listening, and for the first time he turned to face the noise. He knew he had to see what was there to know its shape, to understand its form. He had to for all of them. He was a sentry, standing watch on the shores of the human soul. We were safe, for now, huddled together in the dark, protected only by the monsters we made ourselves.